My husband kissed my forehead when he left me at Rosewood Nursing Home. 3 weeks, he promised. Then I'm bringing you home. 4 days later, a nurse showed me a photograph of Richard boarding a plane with a woman young enough to be our daughter. Behind them, on the screen of her phone, was the house we had shared for 38 years. A red banner stretched across the listing. Sold. Richard believed my stroke had destroyed my memory. He was wrong, and he had just sold property he never legally owned. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 67 years old, and 3 weeks ago I was a woman who still trusted her husband. I want to tell you exactly how that trust died, piece by piece, and how I found the strength to take back everything he thought he had already stolen. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth, the sudden weakness in my left hand as I tried to pour coffee, and Richard's voice sounding very far away as he called for an ambulance. I remember being grateful, in that frightened moment, that after 38 years of marriage, he was still the man who would not leave my side. I was wrong about that too. The doctors called it a minor ischemic event. My speech was slightly slurred for 2 days. My left hand trembled when I tried to hold a pen, but my mind, the part of me that remembers birthdays and grudges, and the exact placement of my mother's china in the hutch, that part came through untouched. I want you to remember that, because Richard is going to spend the next several weeks telling everyone in his life that it did not. Rosewood Rehabilitation and Nursing Center sits on a quiet road outside of town, surrounded by pine trees, that Richard said would be peaceful for me. He drove me there himself, carried my overnight bag into a room with pale green walls, and sat on the edge of my bed holding my good hand. 3 weeks, he said again. I'll fix up the bedroom while you're here. New rails in the bathroom. I'll get one of those raised toilet seats the doctor mentioned. I want everything perfect before you come home. I believed him. I had believed him for 38 years. Why would I stop on a Tuesday in March? He kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and said he would visit the next afternoon with clean clothes and the photograph of our wedding day that sits on my nightstand, the one where I am laughing at something just out of frame. He never brought the photograph. He never came back at all. The first 2 days, I told myself he was overwhelmed. Richard had never been good at hospitals or illness. He hated the smell of antiseptic, hated the sound of monitors, hated anything that reminded him he was 69 years old and not invincible. I imagined him at home, alone, perhaps drinking too much coffee and avoiding the guest room where I kept my sewing things, unable to face an empty house. By the 3rd day, when my calls kept going to voicemail, I asked one of the aides, a heavy-set young man named Curtis, if he would try calling from the front desk phone instead. Perhaps my cell battery was the issue, I told myself. Perhaps Richard simply didn't recognize the number. Curtis came back looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Carter, I did reach him, he said. Curtis hesitated, glancing at his clipboard like it might tell him how to phrase things gently. He said you might get confused about finances after everything you've been through, and he asked us not to let you make what he called confusing financial calls for a little while, just until things settle. I sat very still on the edge of my bed. Confusing financial calls, I repeated. I called to ask when my husband was bringing me clean underwear, Curtis, not to negotiate a mortgage. Curtis looked genuinely sorry, but policy is policy, and Richard had apparently already made himself the primary point of contact for anything involving money, insurance, or paperwork. I remember lying awake that night, staring at the water stain shaped like Florida on the ceiling tile above my bed, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the stroke. Richard was not overwhelmed. Richard was constructing something. I simply did not yet understand what. On the 4th day, a nurse named Maya Bennett came in to check my blood pressure and found me crying, quietly, the kind of crying you do when you don't want anyone to notice. Maya was younger than my daughter, maybe 30, with kind, dark eyes and the particular patience of someone who has spent years being underestimated by doctors twice her age. You don't seem confused to me, Mrs. Carter, she said carefully, wrapping the cuff around my arm. Your chart says cognitive decline is a concern. I've been doing this 6 years. I know what cognitive decline looks like. This isn't that. I told her about the phone calls. About Curtis. About the eerie, deliberate silence from a husband who had once called me twice a day just to ask what I wanted for dinner. Maya glanced at the door, then pulled the little rolling table closer and set her tablet on it. Do you want to look something up? Just to put your mind at ease? I gave her our address. My hands were shaking too badly to type. The real estate listing came up in seconds. Our house, the white colonial with the wraparound porch my father built with his own hands the summer I turned 12, filled the screen, professionally photographed, staged with furniture that was not ours. Fresh flowers on a kitchen island where my grandmother's teapot should have been sitting. The listing description used the words, motivated seller and urgent relocation. Below the photographs, in bold red letters, was a single word, sold. I could not breathe. Maya's hand found my shoulder, steady and warm, while I stared at a stranger's staged furniture inside my father's house. Evelyn, she said quietly, using my first name for the first time. When was this listed? I made her scroll to the listing history. 8 days earlier. 2 days after Richard drove me to Rosewood with promises of handrails and raised toilet seats, our house had gone on the market. 6 days after that, it was already marked sold, at a price nearly $40,000 below what the Hendersons 2 doors down had gotten for a smaller lot the previous spring. Someone wanted this to move fast, Maya said. She wasn't asking. She was thinking out loud, and I found myself grateful that she was thinking at all, because my own mind felt like it was trying to process a language I had never learned. That was the first CTA moment worth pausing on, though I did not know yet how much further the lies would go. Before I tell you what we found stapled to the back of that listing, the signature that was supposed to be mine, I want to ask you something. If someone you had trusted for 38 years suddenly began erasing you from your own life, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you do what I did and stay quiet long enough to gather every last piece of proof first? Tell me in the comments. And if Evelyn's fight already has you holding your breath, subscribe now, because what happened when Richard finally came home was not what any of us expected. Maya kept scrolling. Beneath the listing, linked through a real estate agent's public social media account, was a photograph posted 11 hours earlier. Richard, in a gray linen blazer I did not recognize, standing at what looked like an airport gate. Beside him, her arm looped through his, was a woman perhaps in her mid-30s, blonde, glowing with the particular self-satisfaction of someone who believes she has won something. The caption read, "New beginnings, finally." "Do you know her?" Maya asked. I did. That was the worst part. I recognized the woman in that photograph immediately, and recognizing her made everything else fall into place with a speed that frightened me. Her name was Vanessa Blake. Richard had introduced her to me 9 months earlier as a financial consultant, someone he'd hired to help streamline our retirement accounts before he fully retired from the accounting firm where he'd spent 30 years shuffling other people's money. She had sat at our dining room table with a leather portfolio and a practiced, sympathetic smile, walking us through spreadsheets I did not fully understand, using words like diversification and estate efficiency, while Richard nodded along, as though he understood every syllable. I remembered small things now, the way you remember a word on the tip of your tongue once someone finally says it aloud. Richard changing the password on our joint online banking account and telling me it was for security. Richard taking calls in the garage with the door shut, something he had never done in 38 years of marriage. A charge on our credit card statement from a hotel 40 minutes away, which he explained as a client dinner that ran late. New cufflinks, a haircut that made him look younger and more expensive. The way he had begun angling his phone away from me on the couch, the way you angle a hand of cards. I had noticed all of it. I had simply chosen, the way wives of a certain age are taught to choose, to believe the man rather than the evidence. Mrs. Carter, Maya's voice pulled me back. I have to finish my rounds, but I don't like what I'm seeing here. If you want, I can help you look into this more when I'm off shift. Off the record. I gripped her hand, my weak left hand, the one that still trembled, and I told her yes, please, anything. That night I lay in the narrow bed at Rosewood, listening to the low hum of the hallway lights, and I thought about my father. Walter Whitmore had been dead 11 years, but I could still hear his voice, as clearly as if he were standing in the doorway. My father had built that house himself, board by board, the summer after he came back from Korea, and he had never trusted anyone else's name to sit next to his on a deed, not even, in the end, my own husband's. That land is yours, Evie, he told me once, years before he died, sitting on the porch he'd built with his own hands. Whatever happens with Richard, whatever happens with anybody, that house and that land belong to you and only you. I made sure of it. Samuel Whitaker drew up the papers himself. You keep them somewhere safe, and you don't dare let anybody talk you into signing them away, not even your own husband, not without Samuel looking at it first. I had nodded at the time the way you nod at a father's old-fashioned caution, half listening, thinking of other things. I had never imagined I would need those words 9 years later, lying in a nursing home bed while my husband boarded a plane with our marriage's replacement. Richard had lived in that house for 38 years. He had painted the shutters, mowed the lawn, hosted Thanksgiving dinners in the dining room, and over the decades I think he had simply forgotten, or convinced himself it no longer mattered, that his name had never once appeared on the deed. My father's trust had passed the property to me alone, protected specifically from ever becoming shared marital property, exactly the kind of arrangement a careful man makes when he has watched too many friends lose everything in ugly divorces. Richard had just sold a house he did not own. He simply did not know it yet. I called my daughter first thing the next morning, before breakfast trays even made their rounds. Claire answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that particular briskness she uses when she is already bracing for bad news. Claire is 41, a project manager for a logistics company, married to a decent but forgettable man named Todd, and she has spent most of her adult life being the responsible one, the fixer, the daughter who calls the plumber when something breaks. Mom, hi, I was going to call you today anyway. Dad told me the house sold. I closed my eyes. So Richard had gotten to her first. Of course he had. Claire, I never agreed to sell that house. There was a pause, the kind that told me everything I needed to know about what Richard had already said. Mom, Dad said you'd probably be upset, that you might not remember agreeing to it because of everything with your stroke. He said the doctors mentioned some confusion could happen. He said the house had to be sold to cover your long-term care, that Rosewood costs a fortune, and your Medicare doesn't cover the kind of extended stay you might need. Claire, I do not need extended care. I had a minor stroke. I am walking with a cane. I am not losing my mind. He said you might get defensive about it. He said you got upset with him too, and accused him of things that weren't true. I felt something in my chest crack, quietly, the particular pain of being disbelieved by your own child. Claire, look at me. Listen to my voice. Do I sound confused to you? You sound upset, Mom. That's not the same thing. I asked her, carefully, to picture something for me. I asked her to remember the summer she was 9 and broke her arm falling off the Halversons' trampoline, and how she'd begged me not to tell her father because he'd been so stressed about his mother's illness that year, and how I had kept that secret with her for 3 days until the swelling got too bad to hide any longer. I asked her if a confused, incapacitated woman could recall a detail like that. There was a long silence. Dad's been under a lot of stress too, Mom, Claire finally said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. I don't know what to believe right now. My son Daniel was worse, in his own way. Daniel is 38, divorced, and has spent his entire life avoiding conflict the way other people avoid touching a hot stove. When I called him, he listened for perhaps 90 seconds before he said, Mom, I really don't want to get in the middle of whatever's happening between you and Dad, and found a reason to end the call. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after that, feeling more alone than I had felt at any point since the stroke itself. Richard had not simply lied to our children. He had gotten there first, framed the entire story before I could speak a word in my own defense, and turned my own stroke into the evidence against me. That afternoon, the facility's administrator, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Swin, asked to speak with me in her office. She explained, with the careful diplomacy of someone who has delivered uncomfortable news many times before, that Richard had paid only a partial deposit toward my care, listed himself as my sole financial decision-maker, and had not returned calls regarding the remaining balance. "If we don't receive further payment within 2 weeks, Mrs. Carter, we may need to discuss transferring you to a state-assisted facility," Patricia said. "I'm sorry. I know this is a lot on top of everything else." I sat there absorbing the fact that Richard had sold a $400,000 house and had not set aside a single dollar for the care he claimed necessitated the sale in the first place. Whatever he was planning to do with that money, it was not paying for my recovery. Walking back to my room, I passed the small nurses' station and overheard 2 staff members discussing paperwork, something about a physician's note confirming diminished capacity that had come in through a fax machine that morning. I stopped in the hallway, gripping my cane, and asked to see it. The nurse hesitated, glanced toward Patricia's office, and finally showed me a single page. It was a form letter on official-looking letterhead from a doctor's office I had never visited, suggesting that my stroke had resulted in moderate cognitive impairment affecting financial decision-making. It bore a signature I did not recognize, from a physician whose name meant nothing to me. Richard was not simply lying to our children. He was building an official record, a paper trail designed to make me legally invisible before I even understood I needed to fight back. That night, lying awake, I finally let myself remember my father's voice in full. Not just the porch conversation, but the specific name he had given me all those years ago. Samuel Whitaker. My father's attorney, a careful, old-fashioned man who had drawn up the trust that protected our land, who had told me once, over tea at my parents' kitchen table, that if anything ever felt wrong regarding that property, I was to call him directly, day or night, and not sign a single document without his eyes on it first. I did not have his number memorized. I barely remembered his face after all these years. But Maya, when she came on shift the next morning, found him for me in less than 10 minutes on her tablet, still practicing at 74 out of a small office 2 towns over. My hands shook so badly dialing the number that Maya had to hold the phone steady against my ear. "Whitaker and Associates. Samuel, this is Evelyn Carter, Walter Whitmore's daughter." I took a breath. "I need to speak with you about the trust my father set up. I never authorized a sale of my property. I never signed a power of attorney. And I'm calling you from a nursing home that my husband placed me in and then abandoned." The silence on the other end lasted only a second, but I felt the entire shape of the conversation change within it. "Evelyn." His voice had gone flat and careful, a lawyer's voice, the sound of a man setting aside every assumption he'd been operating under. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out," I told him. All of it. The stroke, the promise of 3 weeks, the sudden silence, the listing, the photograph of Richard and Vanessa at the airport, the forged medical letter, the frozen calls, the children who did not believe me. "Do not confront your husband yet," Samuel said when I finished. "Do not tell your children any more than you already have. I'm going to pull the county records myself this afternoon, and I'm going to look at that trust language line by line. If what you're telling me is accurate, Evelyn, your husband has committed real estate fraud against a property he was never legally entitled to sell. But I need to move carefully, and I need you to trust me for a few days." I told him I had nothing left to do but trust someone. 2 days later, Samuel called back, and this time his voice carried something I had not heard from another human being in nearly 2 weeks. Certainty on my side. "Evelyn, I have the original trust document in front of me. Your father structured it exactly the way I remembered. The property passed to you individually, protected explicitly from becoming marital property, with language specifically preventing a spouse from acting as trustee or holding any ownership interest without your direct, notarized consent. Richard's name has never once appeared on that deed, not in 38 years. And the power of attorney? I've had a forensic document examiner look at the signature. It isn't yours, Evelyn. The pressure points, the letter formation, none of it matches your verified signature on file with my office. Whoever signed that document did it in a hurry, and did it badly. Given the timeline, I suspect your husband used an inexperienced or willing intermediary at the closing to rush the paperwork through before anyone could scrutinize it closely. I sat with the phone pressed hard against my ear, tears running freely now, not from grief, but from something closer to fury finally finding somewhere to go. There's one more thing, Samuel said. The full proceeds from the sale haven't cleared the title company's escrow yet. There was a delay related to a lien search. If we move fast, Evelyn, we can freeze that money before your husband ever touches a dollar of it. Richard thought he had left an invalid woman behind. What he had actually left behind was the only person who could prove every dollar in his new life belonged to someone else. Claire showed up at Rosewood 3 days later, unannounced, still clearly expecting to find the confused, defensive woman her father had described. I watched her face change in real time as we talked, as I recalled details of her childhood with total clarity, as I showed her, on Maya's tablet, the county trust documents Samuel had emailed over, my father's careful, old-fashioned signature at the bottom of a page dated decades before Claire was even born. Mom. Claire's voice had gone very small. Why would Dad do this? I did not have a complete answer for her yet. I only knew that the man I had married 38 years ago had somehow become a man capable of forging his own wife's signature, and I intended to find out exactly how far that transformation had gone. Richard finally called 4 days after the photograph surfaced, his voice arriving through the phone with the same warm, reasonable tone he used when he was about to ask me for something he knew I wouldn't want to give. Evelyn, sweetheart, I've been so worried about you. The doctor said you might get confused, might not remember our conversation about the house. Remind me then, I said carefully, letting a slight waver enter my voice, the practiced uncertainty of a woman he still believed was slipping. Maya sat beside me, silently recording on her own phone, the screen angled discreetly toward the bed. Remind me what we agreed to, Richard. He explained it slowly, condescendingly, the way you explain something to a child. The house had to be sold to cover my medical expenses. I had agreed to it before the stroke worsened my memory. Vanessa was simply helping him manage the transition because he was overwhelmed handling everything alone. And the paperwork, I said softly. The power of attorney. Remind me when I signed that. There was the smallest hesitation, so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening for exactly that. At the kitchen table, honey, the week before you went into Rosewood, you don't remember because of the stroke. But I hadn't had the stroke yet the week before I went into Rosewood, Richard. I hadn't had it yet. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Then Richard's voice hardened, just slightly, just enough. Evelyn, I don't know what people have been telling you, but you need to stop making this harder than it has to be. I let him talk himself further into contradiction for another 10 minutes, gathering every inconsistency like stones in a pocket, before I told him I was tired and needed to rest. He said he loved me before he hung up. I believed, for the first time in 38 years, that he was lying about that too. 900 miles away, in a hotel suite Richard had promised would only be temporary, Vanessa Blake was beginning to have questions of her own. She had believed, when this began, that Richard owned that house outright, a reward for decades of faithful marriage to a woman he described as controlling and cold. She had believed the sale proceeds would fund the life he'd promised her, a beachfront property, early retirement, the freedom his difficult marriage had denied him for so long. Instead, she watched him grow evasive every time she asked when the funds would clear, watched him take calls in the bathroom with the water running, watched the confident man who'd courted her for 9 months become defensive and short-tempered. Richard, did she actually sign that power of attorney? Vanessa finally asked him directly, over room service dinner he barely touched. Because you're acting like a man who's worried someone's going to check. His answer, when it came, was too fast, too sharp, and it frightened her more than any lie he could have told slowly. I did not learn about that particular conversation until much later. What I did learn, 3 days after my call with Richard, was that Samuel had uncovered something far larger than a fraudulent house sale. Evelyn, I need you to sit down for this, Samuel said when he called. While I was pulling records related to the sale, I found something else. Your husband applied for a substantial personal loan 2 weeks before your stroke, using the house as collateral, a house he never had the legal right to pledge. And there's more. There's a filing, initiated the week you were admitted to Rosewood, requesting a court evaluation of your competency to manage your own financial and legal affairs. I felt the floor of my understanding shift entirely. He wasn't just trying to sell the house and disappear, Evelyn. He was trying to have you declared legally incompetent. If that petition had succeeded, he wouldn't have needed a power of attorney at all. He would have had total legal control over everything you own, your trust, your accounts, your father's entire estate, permanently, with a court's blessing. Richard had not simply abandoned me at Rosewood. He had intended to erase me entirely, to turn my recovering body into evidence of a mind he could then legally claim as broken beyond repair, all so that nothing, not one signature, not one objection, not one inconvenient fact about a deed, would ever stand between him and the life he wanted with Vanessa Blake. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay in the narrow bed with the water-stained ceiling tile above me and tried to imagine the version of my life Richard had been quietly engineering. A courtroom I would never be told about until it was already over. A judge reviewing a doctor's letter from a physician I had never met, describing a decline I had never experienced. A gavel deciding that Evelyn Carter, 67 years old, mother of 2, daughter of Walter Whitmore, could no longer be trusted to manage her own name. I thought about all the women I had known over the years who had simply disappeared into decisions like that, quietly, without anyone outside their immediate family ever questioning it. An aunt of mine, decades ago, had spent the last 12 years of her life in a facility chosen entirely by her son. Her own house sold out from under her while she was recovering from a hip fracture, and the family had always spoken of it afterward as a sad but sensible thing, an inevitability rather than a theft. I remembered thinking, at the time, how convenient it must have been for everyone except her. I was not going to become my aunt's story. The next morning, I asked Maya to help me draft a list, the kind of list my father would have approved of, practical and unsentimental. Every document Richard had used against me, every date, every name. Samuel had taught me, over our many phone calls, that fraud cases are won or lost on precision, not outrage, and I intended to give him precision. Robert, my physical therapist, noticed the change in me before almost anyone else did. "You're pushing harder this week, Mrs. Carter," he said, steadying my elbow as I completed a lap of the hallway without stopping to rest against the rail. "Something happen?" "Someone tried to convince a judge I couldn't take care of myself," I told him. "I intend to walk into that courtroom, if it ever comes to that, without a cane in my hand." It did not come to that particular courtroom, in the end, because Samuel moved quickly enough to have the incompetency petition withdrawn, before it was ever heard, using an affidavit from my own treating neurologist confirming full cognitive function, along with Samuel's forensic evidence regarding the forged power of attorney. But I did not know in that moment that the petition would be stopped. I only knew that I intended to be ready for it regardless, and that intention changed something in how I moved through every hour of my recovery from then on. I spent the following weeks doing 2 kinds of work at once. In the mornings, I worked with a physical therapist named Robert, a patient bear of a man who did not treat me like glass. In the afternoons, I worked with Samuel, Maya, and eventually Claire, building a case that would prove exactly how far Richard had gone. The physical work came first, because I understood, in a way I could not fully explain, that my body and my case were the same fight. Every time Richard's story described me as fragile and confused, I answered it by standing a little straighter. The first week, I could not walk from my bed to the window without Robert's arm under mine. By the third week, I was crossing the hallway with a cane, my left hand no longer trembling when I signed my own name. I made a point of signing my name often during those weeks, on get-well cards, on a birthday card for one of the aides, on anything that gave me an excuse to prove, in ink, that my signature had not changed, had never wavered the way the forged documents had. Claire came back 3 days after our first real conversation, and this time she did not come reluctantly. She came with her laptop and a legal pad and an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a teenager, preparing to argue her way out of a curfew. "I want to help," she said. "Really help. Not just believe you, Mom, help." I will admit I did not forgive her instantly for the days she had spent doubting me. Trust, once cracked, does not simply reset because the person apologizes. I told her that honestly, and to her credit, she did not flinch from it. "You believed him because he got to you first and he sounded calm," I told her. "I understand why. I believed him for 38 years for the same reason. But I need you to understand what that cost me. Sitting in this bed, being told by my own daughter that I sounded confused. I know, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm going to prove it to you, not just say it." She kept that promise. Over the following 2 weeks, Claire combed through years of joint email accounts Richard had never bothered to fully close her out of, from back when she'd helped him set up his retirement portal. She found an email chain between Richard and a real estate agent named Douglas Pruitt, dated 6 weeks before my stroke, discussing an expedited sales strategy for a property whose deed Richard described, in writing, as being in a legal gray area worth resolving quietly. He had known. Long before my stroke, long before Rosewood, Richard had known the house was not fully his, and he had been quietly searching for a way around that inconvenient fact. Claire also found the receipts. A $5,000 deposit on a beachfront rental in Vanessa's name, dated the week before I was admitted to Rosewood. A search history, still logged into a shared cloud account, for phrases like declaring a spouse legally incompetent and power of attorney without spouse consent, searched in the months leading up to my stroke, not after it. "He was planning this before you even got sick," Claire said quietly, staring at her laptop screen. "The stroke didn't create the plan, Mom. It just gave him the opportunity to speed it up." That detail sat heavier with me than almost anything else. I had spent weeks quietly wondering whether the stress Richard caused me, the years of controlling behavior, the tension I had absorbed and swallowed, had somehow contributed to my own stroke. Learning that his plan predated my illness entirely, that he had simply been waiting for any opening at all, was its own strange relief. I had not broken myself trying to please him. He had simply been waiting for me to become vulnerable in any way he could use. Daniel came around more slowly, and in a way that mattered more precisely because it was slow. 3 weeks into my recovery, he called me, his voice tight in a way I had never heard from my even-tempered son. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I didn't understand what I was signing." He explained that Richard had asked him, casually, over drinks a few months earlier, to witness a document for some estate paperwork, assuring him it was routine, nothing to worry about. Daniel had signed where indicated, without reading it closely, trusting his father, the way sons are taught to trust their fathers. "I think that's the power of attorney, Mom, or something connected to it. I think I helped him do this without even knowing it." I could hear the guilt in his voice, raw and unpracticed. The guilt of a man who avoids conflict, precisely because he has never had to face what his avoidance costs other people. "Daniel, did you know what you were signing?" "No. God, no, Mom. I swear." "Then I need you to fix it, now that you do know. I need you to give a statement to Samuel about exactly what your father told you, exactly what that document looked like, Everything you remember. It took him 2 more days to work up the courage. But he did it. He sat in Samuel's office and gave a detailed sworn statement describing the document Richard had asked him to witness, confirming it bore no notary seal, no proper witnessing language, nothing resembling a legitimate power of attorney execution. It was, Samuel later told me, one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case, precisely because Daniel had no motive to lie, and every reason, given his conflict-avoidant nature, to simply stay silent instead. He took a real risk giving that statement, Samuel told me. Your husband could make his life difficult if this ever turns hostile. Your son did it anyway. I felt something loosen in my chest when I heard that. My children were not the family Richard had convinced them to be, at least not permanently. They were simply slow to see what I had been forced to see all at once, and I found, once the initial hurt of their disbelief began to fade, that I could not entirely blame them for trusting a father who had spent decades earning exactly that kind of trust before he decided to spend it all at once, on a lie this large. It did not make the weeks of doubt easier to have lived through, but it made them easier, eventually, to forgive. Vanessa Blake's unraveling happened at roughly the same time, though I did not learn the full shape of it until much later. She had known, from the beginning, that Richard was married. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be too easy to paint her as an innocent victim of Richard's manipulation the way I was. She knew. She had participated willingly in an affair with a married man for the better part of a year, but she had not known the extent of what Richard was lying about. She had believed, because he told her so directly and repeatedly, that the house was legally his to sell, that our marriage had effectively ended years earlier in every way that mattered, that I was cognitively unable to understand or object to any of it. She had not known about the forged power of attorney. She had not known about the fraudulent doctor's letter. She had certainly not known about the petition to have me declared legally incompetent, a document that, once she learned of it, made even her stomach turn. The final crack came when Vanessa discovered, scrolling through Richard's phone while he showered one morning in that increasingly less glamorous hotel suite, a series of messages between Richard and another woman entirely, a former colleague from his accounting firm, messages that made clear Richard had been quietly hedging his options in case the money from our house never fully materialized. Vanessa had given up her own apartment for this man. She had told her sister she was finally going to be happy, and she was looking at proof that Richard had been prepared to abandon her exactly as coldly as he had abandoned me, the moment a better opportunity presented itself. She contacted Samuel's office anonymously at first, then formally, once she understood that cooperating might protect her from being pulled fully into the fraud charges Richard alone deserved. She provided messages, financial records, and a written statement describing conversations, in which Richard discussed the incompetency petition explicitly, calling it, in her own words, the fastest way to make sure the old bag can't fight back. I will admit that phrase, when Samuel read it to me, hurt in a way I had not expected. Not because Vanessa said it, because Richard had. There was a particular afternoon, about a month into all of this, when Claire brought her laptop to my room and set it on the rolling table the way Maya once had, and the two of us spent 3 hours going through Richard's old calendar entries together, the way we used to go through photo albums when she was small. It should have felt strange, dismantling her father's secret life, piece by piece with her mother's help. But instead, it felt almost like healing, the two of us finally on the same side of something after weeks of her doubting me. Look at this one, Claire said, turning the screen toward me. An entry from 4 months earlier read simply, V, 2 p.m., usual place, recurring weekly, tucked between dentist appointments and a golf outing, with men from his old firm. He wasn't even trying that hard to hide it. He just knew none of us would ever think to look. That was the part that stayed with me longest, longer than the forged signature or the fraudulent letter. Richard had not needed to be particularly clever, because for 38 years, no one in our family had ever imagined he needed watching. That kind of trust, once you understand how thoroughly it was exploited, is difficult to feel foolish for having given. I decided, somewhere in that stretch of afternoons with Claire, that I would rather have been the trusting one who eventually fought back than the suspicious one who never had to. Daniel's growth, once it started, surprised me daily. He began driving the 2 hours to Rosewood most weekends, at first simply to keep me company, and later to help me organize the growing folder of evidence Samuel needed. He was, I discovered, unexpectedly good at it, methodical in a way his conflict avoidance had always masked. "I think I just needed something worth being uncomfortable for," he told me once, only half joking, sorting bank statements into neat chronological stacks on my bed. By the 5th week, I was walking the length of the Rosewood garden path without my cane at all, leaning only occasionally on Claire's arm, when the uneven paving stones caught me off guard. Robert signed off on my discharge not long after, noting in his final assessment that my recovery had progressed significantly faster than the initial prognosis suggested, a sentence I made Maya read aloud to me twice, savoring it the way I once savored good news about my children. 6 weeks after Richard left me at Rosewood promising 3 weeks and handrails, the frozen escrow funds, the forged documents, Daniel's sworn statement, Claire's emails, and Vanessa's messages had built something Samuel described, with quiet satisfaction, as a case even a bad lawyer couldn't lose. Richard returned to the United States believing none of this had happened. He believed the sale proceeds had simply been delayed by ordinary paperwork, that a quick meeting with the title company would release the funds, that Evelyn Carter remained exactly where he had left her, confused, isolated, and easy to outmaneuver. Samuel arranged the meeting under the pretense Richard expected, a routine closing discussion regarding a delay in fund disbursement. Richard walked into a conference room at Samuel's office wearing a new suit I did not recognize, looking tanned and rested in a way that made something in me go cold with anger before he had even said a word. He stopped walking the moment he saw me. I was sitting upright at the head of the table, dressed carefully, my cane resting against my chair rather than gripped in my hand. Claire sat on my left, Daniel sat on my right, Samuel sat across from Richard's empty chair, a folder of documents squared neatly in front of him. A representative from the district attorney's financial crimes unit sat quietly near the window, introduced simply as an observer for now. "Evelyn." Richard's voice cracked slightly on my name. "You look." He stopped himself, clearly recalculating whatever sentence he had planned to say to a woman he expected to find diminished. "Sit down, Richard," Samuel said calmly. "We have quite a bit to discuss." I watched my husband of 38 years attempt, for the next 40 minutes, to talk his way out of a case built from his own emails, his own son's sworn statement, his own mistress's messages, and a signature that a forensic examiner had already proven was not mine. He tried warmth first, appealing to our marriage, our history, the children sitting beside me. When that failed, he tried anger, accusing me of turning our family against him, of exaggerating a simple financial misunderstanding into something criminal. "Richard," I finally said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "you didn't check whose name was on the deed." "That's not a misunderstanding, that's the entire story." He had no answer for that. Samuel laid out, methodically, exactly what awaited him. The sale would be voided and unwound through the title company's insurance and a court-ordered restitution process, since the buyers themselves had acted in good faith and did not deserve to lose their purchase to Richard's fraud. The remaining escrow funds, still frozen, would be returned to my trust in full. The forged power of attorney, the fraudulent medical letter, and the incompetency petition would all be forwarded to the district attorney's office as evidence in a criminal fraud investigation. Richard's access to our joint accounts, already restricted by court order Samuel had quietly obtained days earlier, would remain frozen pending the outcome. Richard looked, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely afraid. There is a particular silence that settles over a room when a man realizes the story he has been telling everyone, including himself, no longer holds together. I watched that silence settle over Richard as Samuel slid the forensic handwriting report across the table toward him, the examiner's side-by-side comparison of my real signature and the one on the power of attorney laid out in exacting, clinical detail. "This isn't your wife's signature, Richard," Samuel said, tapping the page once. "It isn't close. Whoever forged this did it without ever seeing an authentic sample to copy from. Would you like to tell us who signed it?" Richard's jaw worked silently for a moment. "I don't have to answer that." "You don't," Samuel agreed pleasantly. "The district attorney's office will simply ask instead, under oath, and you'll be answering with considerably less room to maneuver than you have right now." I watched something in Richard finally break, not into remorse, but into the particular resentment of a man who has always believed the consequences of his choices belong to someone else. He turned to me, and for one strange moment, I saw, underneath the tan and the new suit and the practiced charm, the frightened, cornered version of the man I had married. It did not move me the way it might have a year earlier. "You always thought you were better than me," Richard said quietly, bitterly, "because your father's money built that house instead of mine." "No, Richard," I said. "I never thought that, not once in 38 years. You decided it yourself, somewhere along the way, and then you spent the rest of our marriage quietly punishing me for it. Evelyn, please, we can figure this out. Just the two of us." "There is no two of us, Richard," I said. "There hasn't been. Not really. For longer than either of us wants to admit. You made sure of that the moment you decided my recovery was an opportunity, instead of a marriage to protect." Vanessa's decision to cooperate had not come easily, or quickly. I learned later, through Samuel, that she had spent nearly 2 weeks agonizing over what to do with what she knew, torn between loyalty to a man she still, in some diminished way, believed she loved, and a growing, sickening certainty that she had been used as thoroughly as I had, simply for a different purpose. The message that finally moved her, Samuel told me, was the one in which Richard referred to me, in writing, as an obstacle rather than a wife. "I don't expect anyone to feel sorry for me," Vanessa wrote in the statement she eventually gave, a portion of which Samuel read to me once the investigation had run its course. "I knew he was married, I own that. But I did not know he was capable of trying to have a woman declared incompetent to steal her inheritance, and once I did know, I could not keep pretending I hadn't seen it. It was not redemption exactly, but it was honesty arriving later than it should have, which I have come to believe is still worth something, even when it arrives too late to undo the damage already done." Vanessa did not attend that meeting. She had already, through her cooperation, distanced herself from the worst of the coming consequences, though she would still face her own legal reckoning for her role in facilitating a fraudulent transaction she knew, at minimum by the end, to be built on lies. She left Richard permanently the week the fraud investigation went public, moving back in with her sister, her dream of a beachfront retirement replaced by the much smaller, much colder reality of what she had actually helped build. The criminal investigation took the better part of a year to resolve. Richard was ultimately charged with forgery, real estate fraud, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a charge that struck me as almost unbearably ironic given how completely he had underestimated exactly how invulnerable I actually was. He accepted a plea agreement that included full financial restitution, a lengthy probation period, and a permanent record that would follow him for whatever years he had left. I filed for divorce the same month the criminal charges were formally filed. 38 years, reduced finally to paperwork Samuel helped me file correctly, properly witnessed, properly notarized, nothing about it forged or rushed or hidden from anyone. I did keep the house, in the end, though I sold it 18 months later, once I understood I did not want to spend my remaining years alone, in rooms that still echoed with 38 years of a marriage I now understood differently. I used a portion of the settlement to establish a small fund, working with a local elder advocacy nonprofit, specifically to help older adults recognize and fight financial exploitation by family members, the exact kind of quiet theft that so often goes unreported because the victims are told, again and again, that no one will believe them. Maya and I remained close. She left nursing eventually to pursue a law degree, telling me once, only half joking, that our case had shown her exactly what kind of law she wanted to practice. Claire and I rebuilt our relationship slowly and honestly, with the kind of care you give something you nearly lost. Daniel, to my quiet pride, became noticeably less conflict avoidant in the years that followed, the guilt of that unread signature having taught him something about the cost of easy silence that I doubt he will ever fully unlearn. As for Richard, I heard, secondhand, that he lives now in a small apartment 2 towns over, working part-time, his name quietly known among people who once respected him. I feel less anger about that than I expected to. Mostly I feel something closer to clarity. Richard believed that growing older had made me invisible, easy to sideline, easy to erase with a forged signature and a hurried closing. He was wrong about that in every way that mattered. Invisible women hear everything. We remember everything, and sometimes, when a man least expects it, we hold the one signature capable of bringing his entire carefully constructed lie to its knees. If you were in my position, would you have forgiven Claire and Daniel as quickly as I did? Or held on to that hurt longer? And what consequence do you think Richard actually deserved? Tell me below. If you believe in stories where the quiet ones win in the end, subscribe, because Evelyn Carter is not the only woman who has had to prove she was still there all along.